Where is he?
I cannot describe how honored I am. Charlie's agreed to be our featured speaker at this month's meeting. Charlie is a homebrew pioneer and legend. Where would we be without the Complete Joy of Homebrewing Bible, the American Homebrewers Association, the Brewers Association, the BJCP, the GABF, and Zymergy Magazine? I could go on, but to not coin a phrase, let's cut the shuck and jive and get started.
All right. Well,
Where is he?
cheers. All right, let's see.
Cheers, cheers. And I'm going to suggest that folks, if you know how, go to speaker view in your Zoom meeting. And hopefully that will have Charlie pop up in the big picture for you.
Here he is.
And hi, Mr. Papazian, how are you?
I'm doing great. You can hear me fine?
Yes.
I can.
Good.
So we did ask our members to submit interview questions so I could get the bit organized ahead of time. Quite a few questions fit into the AHA origin story category. So what were you thinking? What did you expect, etc.? I thought this would be a good place to start with our interview. So even before the AHA, what were the origins of homebrewing for you?
Well, the origins of my homebrewing were different than the origins of starting the American Home Brewers Association. But where was my head at? Well, I was probably in the origin of the AHA was in a glass of homebrew, I'm sure. I had too much to drink several nights in a row with friends, and we came up with these wild ideas of that evolved over time. That we had, I had been teaching beer making classes, homebrewing classes in Boulder, Colorado, since I had moved there in 1972. And before going back a little further, in 1970, I was going to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and my roommates and I were introduced to a neighborhood home brewer, an old timer who learned his home brewing during Prohibition. So that's what we were treated to, was a Prohibition style homebrew.
Cool.
And the recipe was that he gave us was about 6 lines, 6 short lines. And we didn't know, jack about beer, except that we bought it for 69 cents a 6-pack at the local convenience store as students. And I know that I didn't enjoy the taste of beer very much. I wasn't enjoying it for the flavor or the enjoyability. It was just a thing for college students to kind of experiment with and socialize with. So when we were introduced to this homebrew, we went to his house and he said, "I'm going to go down and get some good stuff for you, something I've aged for a year." He went down and he brought up a quart bottle, a brown bottle, beer bottle full of homebrew, and he poured it out, and it was crystal clear. And we tasted it, and I can't say that it reminded me of anything that I make or or what people brew now, but it certainly was better and more interesting and had flavors that were enjoyable compared to the stuff that we were buying. We were buying the cheap stuff, but it wasn't much different than the expensive stuff. It was all the same back in those days. So we got intrigued. I asked for the recipe, and we went to the supermarket, bought a bunch of cane sugar and a couple of cans of hop flavored malt extract. And it was basically a dump and stir recipe. You empty the can of malt extract into a large, clean trash bin. You added pounds of sugar. You stirred it up, added yeast, and for all we knew, yeast was yeast. So we got bread yeast, and it fermented. And we were all excited, and we bottled it, and ended up throwing the first 2 batches down the drain. It was undrinkable. It wasn't sour, you know. All those years of making homebrew in Charlottesville in the basement of a house that had a coal burning furnace and a dirt floor. I mean, this was crazy to think about, but all those years it was 3 years. My last 3 out of 5 years at the University of Virginia, we were making beer. We never had a sour batch of beer.
Wow.
Never. The first 2 were just way too much. The cane sugar and the bread yeast did a number on the taste that we just didn't come close to tasting like beer. I guess it was kind of bad apple cider, I guess you might describe it as. But I did some research, and there was one book that I came across. It was Fred Eckhart's book. Read that, didn't understand anything about it. And we got some recommendations. I discovered dextrose would make a difference in the quality of the beer. Instead of using cane sugar, using corn sugar. And there were little packages of what they call dry beer yeast. It wasn't the best quality, but it was certainly better than the bread yeast we were buying at the supermarket.
Sure.
And the hop flavored malt extract syrup and the dextrose and the ale yeast that we bought, that did the trick. It was drinkable. We enjoyed it. We had a lot of fun. I wouldn't want to repeat those recipes now, knowing, and I've had so much good beer, but it had a unique flavor, and it turned a lot of people on, other students, friends of ours, and I was kind of the beer homebrew guru in Charlottesville for the last 2 or 3 years I was there. And when I graduated, I moved out to Colorado. Long story short, I didn't anticipate just diving into home brewing again, but I ended up rooming with some people that found, talking about what our interests were, and they said, how to make homebrew, you got to teach us how. So we made some beer, and word spread, and I ended up teaching beer making classes, 5 or 6 week sessions once a week for 8 or 9 years. And out of those beer making classes, there was a community of home brewers that was cultivated in the Boulder, Denver, Fort Collins, Front Range area of Colorado. And, we were, I guess you call, the term is these days is disruptors. Where we were called revolutionaries back then, and we were so jazzed. We were so excited about what we were doing, and we were all discovering and sharing our knowledge. And to this day, I still think that out of necessity, we had to share our knowledge, and that was a foundation of what homebrewing has become, and craft brewing has become. It's in those early days of the roots of we had to share, because the few books that were out there were really lousy. Fred Eckhart's book was not lousy, but it took me a while to develop my own skills before I began to understand what he was talking about.
Yeah,
but
that makes sense.
British books were British, and they were making beer because they were trying to make cheap beer. And we all were trying to make better beer. And there were brewmasters at some of the larger breweries, Coors, for example, and eventually Miller and Anheuser-Busch, that lent their expertise, and or if they were open to answering questions. But that community and the enthusiasm and the parties we had and the sharing and all the beers we were experimenting with spilled over to this idea of, well, there's nothing out there that we knew of that where people could share recipes. So we said, let's put out a newsletter. My friend Charlie Papazian, who is one of my homebrewing students, and we drank a lot of homebrew together, and we said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's think about it for a while. it'd be kind of neat to publish a newsletter and share our experiences and recipes and hints. And, we kept drinking homebrew and got crazier and crazier. And the newsletter turned into an idea for a magazine, and the magazine turned into an idea for the American Home Brewers Association. And that's what
Charlie, I heard a rumor that there may have been a few extra bottles of homebrew involved when you were thinking about all this.
A few. I think you're underestimating them. Someone is. Yeah, we had some good homebrew and mead. We were getting into mead in the early days because there was something about making mead in the back of one of the British homebrewing books, and it just intrigued us. Fermenting honey. Let's try that. And all we knew how to do is make beer. So those first homebrewed meads were about 7 or 8%, and we hopped it because we were brewers, and we flavored it with ginger, and people went nuts over it. People loved it. And the other idea that came out of that mead making was, and this was a very bizarre idea, absolutely on the edge, revolutionary thinking, was to put honey in beer.
Oh, well, yeah.
Besides them all. And, when they talked to big brewers about doing stuff like that, they said, you're crazy. And they laughed, and they kind of, home brewing was a joke to some of them. And, whether it was spices or fruits that we were putting in or honey, it was all just bizarre, strange.
Yeah.
To us as home brewers, it was exciting. And we were doing all these really cool things that were just different in those days.
Yeah. So I had a couple of questions about, and you've already talked at least a little bit about it. It's finding brewing ingredients back in the day. It sounds like the discovery of ale yeast made a big difference as you were getting started. Do you have any other stories about trying to find ingredients?
Well, I probably brewed for 4 or 5 years before I ever saw what hops looked like. I was using hop flavored malt extract because I didn't know that you could buy hops. And then when I eventually noticed that there was a shelf where there were something called hops that they were selling, and you open it up and it was this brown crumbly stuff that turned to dust at your touch. And that's what they call hops. And that's what home brewers were used to using in those days. And they were awful, absolutely awful. They were stale, old, brown, crumbly.
Sounds like we need exactly what we need for our lambic brewing.
Yeah, well, I don't know. These were pretty old. They didn't look like hops at all. But you talk about that package of ale use revolutionized things. Well, I think home brewers revolutionized a lot of different ingredients. The whole idea of using really fresh hops in beer and dry hopping was a homebrew thing. It really was, because people were starting to plant hops, and you got really fresh hops, and people would go to the hop yards and they would experiment. But all the big brewers and regional brewers, they were using hops, and they would refrigerate them. They would put them in a refrigerated room, and they'd be open air. The vacuum pack was there wasn't any vacuum packing of anything in those days. As a matter of fact, Great Fermentations out of Santa Rosa, Byron Birch and Jay Connor, they came up with the idea of vacuum packing and actually putting nitrogen gas into the plastic before they sealed it. And, that made the freshest of hops available to home brewers for the first time. That was probably in the mid 80s, I'd say, mid to late 80s that started. And, home brewers eventually became craft brewers and microbrewers, and people paid attention, and, all these fresh hop all the IPAs and the hoppy flavors that we enjoy today were just, it wasn't even in people's mind. There weren't any, zero. The closest thing was Ballantine IPA was supposedly it had a nice hop flavor, and it was hopped in the barrel and the wood aged barrels, and but I never recall that. I remember having one of my first beers in my life was when I was about 6 years old. I drank some my uncle's Ballantine IPA, and I didn't strike me as being that hoppy.
That reminds me of my first taste of beer, which was foam off the top of my grandpa's Lucky Lager.
Oh.
And there wasn't a lot of hops involved in that.
No, foam tends to be bitter, doesn't it? I mean,
It was, yeah.
yeah.
It was interesting.
And then the other big paradigm shift was Y yeast coming out with smack packs and offering liquid yeast. Before that, you could culture your own, and I remember the Home Brewers Association offered yeast classes at the conferences on how to culture your own yeast and such, and that was a pretty big deal to do it yourself. Otherwise, you had to pay, back in those days, $100 for a slant if you could find one.
Wow.
And culture it up yourself if you wanted any real lager yeast or any true beer yeasts. But things have come so far now.
Yeah, really. So back in the day, how much do you think Jimmy Carter legalizing home brewing had an impact on what you all were doing?
Well, in particular, what we were doing, it had no impact because I didn't even know home brewing was about to be legalized. We already admitted to starting the Home Brewers Association. It just so happened that getting close to publishing the first magazine, we found out that home brewing became legal.
So that was just pretty much of an accident.
It was an accident, and we weren't involved in that at all. It was a trade association and a few friendly congressmen and congress people, and home brewers in New York State and California teamed up to get that passed or amendment inserted into a transportation bill, as it were. But did it influence anything? It did, in a way that homebrew shops could sell winemaking supplies and advertise. And most of them advertised in the yellow pages of phone books or in advertisements in newspapers and word of mouth. But they were really scared as a business to promote that they were selling home brewing supplies. So what the legalization did is kind of bring it out of the closet. Even though you could get the ingredients and get the supplies, it wasn't promoted. And when it wasn't promoted, it wasn't getting any. There weren't enough people buying stuff to have enough turnover of equipment and ingredients to keep the ingredients fresh in the store. So that was the dynamics of it was happening back then. But you could still make good beer.
Yeah. So what inspired you to write the Complete Joy of Homebrewing?
The inspiration was my beer making class. I started out handing out a two-pager in my first classes on how to make beer. 2 pagers became a 6-pager. And back around 1975 or 76, I decided just to put everything that I knew at the time into a 76-page book that I self-published called The Joy of Brewing. And I typed it out on a typewriter and had drawn illustrations made and brought everything down to the local printer and printed up 1,000 copies, and I would hand it out to the students that were taking the class, and I'd sell some to homebrew shops around the country. It wasn't a giant seller or anything like that, but there was probably a few thousand over the years that sold. And then eventually I revised that to about a 90-pager, and then I had this idea of really getting into it and writing another book. And the idea of a big volume edition, which became the Complete Joy of Home Brewing, that idea was sold to a big publisher in New York City, and they sent me a bunch of money as an advance. Seemed like a lot of money to me then. And all of a sudden I was on the hot seat. I had to come up with something. So I really, I knew, I had, that book came out in 1984. So I wrote it in 1983. And by that time I was making some pretty darn good beer, and I knew a lot of professional brewers, and I had experienced a lot of homebrew, and I had traveled enough to know what was real and what was fake home brewing, I guess you could say. You know, all the British homebrew books were, a lot of it was myth that was perpetuated over the years. And I found that out when I made my first trip to Europe and to the UK in 1981. And I visited a lot of real ale breweries, and I went to the Great British Beer Festival.
Right.
And I was astounded. I was really astounded how they could make beer and in 10 or 12 days serve it fresh on tap. And the thing that really threw me for a loop was I was fortunate. I went to Ireland, and I was fortunate to get a tour of the Guinness brewery.
Wow.
Through a connection, one of the maltsters, because they weren't, Guinness wasn't giving tours in those days. And I saw what they were doing. The recipe was classic. It was 10% crystal malt, 10% roasted barley, pale malt, and classic British hops. And the thing that really blew me away was they told me that the beer that they were making that day would be served at the pub across the street in 10 days.
Wow.
And all the books, the British home brewing books, would advise that if you're going to make a stout, you have to be prepared to age it for many months before it's drinkable.
Right.
Well, that was true. You know why? Because the recipes, you were putting black malt in the boil. You're making a malt extract brew and boiling the ingredients, your hops, and you're putting a pound of crushed black malt and roasted barley and boiling that sucker for an hour. And of course, you're going to have an acrid, bitter, black beer that really needed to age for a few months before it mellowed out.
Yeah.
So those kinds of things I found out by just watching what people were actually doing, and I read some professional books about brewing, and my task was to scale down from the 500 barrel batches that were being made, or the 100 barrel batches, down to 5 gallons, and I could figure that out.
Yeah, well, you knew a little bit about math.
A little bit about math, and also I knew that the proportions change when you scale up or scale down, because I talked to enough professional brewers to know that through their pilot brewery experiences. But that came out, and it was, I tell you a story. I think it was $7.99. The book cost. It was a 300 page plus book, and it was interesting that most of the homebrew shops would not carry my book because it was too expensive.
Right.
Brewers are too cheap. They're only going to spend a couple of bucks on a book.
It's probably a little of both, right?
It's sold like crazy at the bookstores, and people were beginning to come to the homebrew shop and said, I want ingredients for this recipe. And they point to the recipes in my book. And after a couple of years, the homebrew shops kind of got it. And they started carrying the book. And between the bookstores and the homebrew shops, the thing, it really skyrocketed. And like from 85 through 89, it just was unbelievable how quickly things changed.
Yeah, yeah. So, Mr. Sean Bush, hopefully you're online, and I think you have a question for Charlie.
So, hey, Charlie, it's awesome to have you talking here. My wife gave me a homebrew kit in 2010 for Christmas.
All right.
And I've been making different recipes on and off through then. One of the earlier recipes for me was Linda's Lovely Light Honey Ginger Lager, which I promptly fermented that lager yeast at 73 degrees because that's what I fermented everything at in Hawaii. What's your favorite recipe out of any of your books that you've made?
Ooh. Well, my favorite recipes are what I have on tap right now. And most of those recipes, there's a version of it either in the Homebrewer's Companion or the fourth edition of the book. But I can tell you what were the most popular 3 or 4 recipes in the books, and the recipes that I heard from most people that they loved, and many people that there are a few recipes that were, as people won a lot of homebrew contests with, and that one was Rocky Raccoon's Honey Lager. That was a really popular one.
That was
There was Christmas Cheer, which used herbs, clove, a little cinnamon, a little bit of ginger, maybe a little anise. That was pretty revolutionary at the time. There weren't a lot of spice beers. I think Anchor was experimenting, just beginning to experience in the early 90s with spice. Trying to think, so many beers in my life. There was a brown ale, Elbro Nurkday brown ale. That was a really popular recipe for everyone because it was the fastest maturing, because it had a little bit of black, roasted malt in it. Those kinds of recipes that had, enough malt to make it brown color really matured quickly. You could drink that homebrew in 12 days from when you started. So that was really appealing to the first time homebrewer, and they really, really liked it. Then Toad Spit Stout was another one. It was a classic malt extract stout with crystal malt and black malt and then roasted barley added in a steep.
Well, as both homebrewers and commercial brewers know, it's all in the marketing. So I think with the Rocky Raccoon and the Toad Spit, they're winners just because of their names.
Well, all the homebrew books prior to mine coming out had recipes, but they were all called recipe number 53 or lager number 42. And it wasn't until it sounds like I'm taking credit for it, but I've done a little bit of research and I can't find any books. I think Fred Eckhart may have had a couple of funny names or clever names, but he called it Bach beer a Bach beer. And doing the beer making classes was so inspirational. I learned so much from the people that came and the experiences we had, but we always would name the beer. It was somebody would do something silly, or it would commemorate some event or person. And we just had a lot of fun naming those beers. And, a lot of more conservative homebrewers thought that it wasn't appropriate to have too much fun making homebrew. But I said, well, you do it your way, I'll do it mine,
Yeah. No
and
kidding.
like my book, there are a few others you can go to, but that was part of the thing. And now you look at the names of beers, and even professional brewers are having some fun.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Hey, Steve Smack, if you're available, I think you have a related question.
Yeah. Hey, Charlie. I've had your book since 1991, and I'm going to butcher the name, but the Polyala India Pale Ale was the first beer that I ever brewed, and it just set me on the right course. I'm wondering if you ever go back and brew any of your original recipes as you originally wrote them or developed them?
Short answer is no, I don't. But when I travel around, I taste enough of other people's renditions of those recipes, and they're spot on. Remind me of the days when I brewed those beers. You know, one of the reasons that particular recipe, palalalia, is a word that describes a word that has a repetitive sound to it.
Mhm.
We thought that was a pretty cool name. But the reason, I think that's the recipe, is an IPA, and you toast your own malt. You kind of spray some pale malt and put it in the oven until
Yes.
you get
Yep.
this beautiful aroma.
Yep.
Let it cool and grind it up and put it in your beer. And I think that was one of the reasons why it was so popular, because you get this really nice biscuity, toasty malt character in the beer.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I had actually forgotten that one little detail of the recipe, and I haven't done that for years. And I'm going to give that a try again.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, one of the things that's the carryover from that recipe is that I regularly use an aromatic malt in my beer, almost most of my beers, because I like that biscuity, toasty character in several styles of beer that I make.
Cool. So, Mr. Gamelin,
Yes.
I think you have a question. And you have a nice background, by the way.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, if you like the background, well, I'm going to turn this background off just for a second because I want to show you, and this won't show up very well with the background on here. So I'm going to turn this off. Yeah. So what I wanted to show you is this is my original book that I bought in 1990 when I was learning how to homebrew. And thank you very much for signing it as well. Relax, don't worry, have a homebrew.
Right.
So my question really is that the Relax, Don't Worry homebrew slogan, it has helped many newbies overcome the fear of going astray, myself included, because at those times we didn't know. I mean, we didn't know what we were getting into. Can you really make beer just from your kitchen? That's a kind of a crazy idea. Something's going to go wrong, right? But so my question is really, because we've seen a tremendous advances in brewing equipment, materials, and processes over the years, I'm wondering, what advances that you're grateful for, and if you have any concerns regarding some of them, and also the sort of the general direction of homebrewing. And the bottom line is, do you think the slogan for the next 50 years of homebrewing should be relax, don't worry, and have a homebrew? Or do you think there might be something else that we would need to carry us through to the next 50 years?
Well, I'll answer your last question first, because I think it's human nature to be intimidated at the challenge of doing something new that you've never done before, and thinking outside the box and following through with ideas that other people think you're crazy for thinking about even. And maybe you don't have the self-confidence. I mean, it's just human nature. No matter, one of the things people tell me is to relax, don't worry, have a homebrew kind of spills over to a lot of other endeavors that they have tackled, despite the anxiety of, I'm going to fail. We're all that way. The first time you try something you've never done before, you take a deep breath, relax, don't worry, and have a homebrew and go forward. And the nice thing, especially with homebrew, is that you might not the beer might not turn out exactly the way you wanted it, but you're going to end up with something that's really good. It's just, the finesse of doing something is a process of learning and experience. And that only comes with time. But getting your butt off square one and doing something is kind of human nature. It's no matter what you're involved with. So I think that's it's still pretty relevant. And the people who have embraced that culture, I think, stick with the hobby and home brewing a lot longer than a person that may have been introduced to home brewing that's purely science and doesn't relate to the fun aspect of it and the human nature and the character of culture of sharing and enjoyability. I think if you don't have all those things, you know, it's just another hobby, and doesn't become a lifestyle that is become for so many of us that are on the screen right now. So that's why I think it's a value. And as far as advances, I think in general, the accessibility of so many cool ingredients in my world. I mean, you want a yeast, you can get it. If you want a malt, you can get it. You want a hop, you can get it. And I guess nowadays the technology, which I'm not really in tune to, I mean, the gadgetry that's out there. I mean, everybody has their own way of embracing home brewing and a hobby. And in this particular hobby, beer making, there's so many things you can kind of embrace, whether it's to history, whether it's malt, whether you want to focus on hops, or you want to play around with yeast. You might be a gadgeteer and you want to make equipment. You want to apply electronic things to it, or you know, historical. You want to make historical. You know, there's so many aspects, but the gadgetry stuff is pretty cool to see. I mean, I've seen some amazing stuff. You know, like you can apps for iPhones that you can monitor your fermentation anywhere you are in the world and tweak what you're doing if you wanted to. I mean, and that all, you know, most of this stuff, like when they went to the moon in 1969, all that technology trickled down to a lot of different things that became part of our day-to-day life, you know, that technology. Well, I think with home brewing and beer making, it's the opposite. It trickles up. I mean, home brewers have been inventing and deciding just for the hell of it, they're going to make an application to make their home brewing life not necessarily more easy, but cooler and neat and more convenient or whatever. And all that stuff kind of trickles up to what craft brewers are using, and even professional brewers now consider doing.
So do you have any concerns about any of the advances that you've seen? Or is there anything, or is it all just great to have a playground and all the different options?
Oh boy. I think that's a leading question. I don't know what you're getting at, but I can say that I'm more of a, and this is just me. I'm more of a traditional craft beer drinker. I'm drinking a mild, English style mild. I tweak things with different kinds of malt and dry hop when the tradition doesn't call for dry hopping, like the Riptide brewer was saying, you know, he dry hops his Pilsner. So do I. So there's so many choices out there. Oh, one of the things that bothers me sometimes is when I go into a tap room and I can't find a good Irish type stout or a classic IPA or a classic American pale ale or a brown ale or a porter or a mild, or, you know, they're all the taps are taken up with 10 different varieties of hazy, juicy IPA. And I think that's taking opportunities away from creating new beer drinkers. But, you know, I'm not in the business. So, you know, if you're just in it to sell what sells, then have at it. But I'm a home brewer and so are we. So you make what you really like. And so, you know, I like to drink with friends. And sometimes when there's pressure, especially this past year, my friend is my beer. And so I'll go back to my having drinks with my old friends of older styles of beer that I've been brewing for years, whether it's a bitter or Rauch beer or a porter or a stout. I enjoy those kinds of beers a lot, and I'm not hopping figuratively and literally. I'm not hopping from one beer to another.
Yeah.
Nice. Good answers. So the last question I have for you is, other than an empty beer cooler, what inspires you to keep brewing after all these years?
Oh, I never let that happen. Ooh. I always have at least one beer for many.
Good answer.
There's always, I always like to have a lager because I can leave that in for months. And I won't keg it. I won't keg it until I have another batch going. If that's the last one. Because, when you're away from home, things are getting better at home if you have beer from it.
But where does your inspiration come from now? I mean, because I don't know if it's the same as what it was when you first started, or if you have different inspirations now.
When I first started, I was trying everything and anything. And that's how I learned. You read my books, and there are all these different kinds of beers. Essentially 99% of every one of those recipes is something that I formulated and tweaked and brewed several times. What inspires me now are trying to recreate experiences, such as being in a beer garden in Bavaria underneath the chestnut tree and having half liters of Helles or their Pils or their Dunkel, and that taste and the feeling of those kinds of beers I like to create at home. Or the dark lager that I enjoyed so much when I was in Prague at the Ufleka Brewery, 400-year-old brew pub. And the only beer they had was this brown lager, which I have perfected to get as close to that as possible, and recreating that experience. And then the Guinness, my Dusty Mud Stout is a Guinness clone, to recreate the stouts that I remember having that were 3.8% on tap in Dublin and throughout Ireland. And the real ales that I had in England. I mean, I didn't like all the real ales. Some I liked more than others, but there were a few that I really liked, and I tried to recreate them. And when I visited the breweries, I was looking around on what kind of hops they were using and what was in that brown paper bag over there, these sacks that weren't malt that they were dumping in. It turned out to be some kind of particular sugar, and I tasted it. And, I just creating those experiences here at home. So
it sounds like you're doing some COVID traveling in your brewery.
Yeah, well, I am. That's a good way to put it.
Speaking of your brewery, can you describe your current brewing setup?
Oh boy. It's old school. It's simple. I have a garage that I dedicate to a workshop as well as a brewery. And I brewed yesterday. I brewed a stout. And it was a nice day. It was almost 60 degrees here in Colorado.
Nice.
So I had the propane heater outside and the garage door open. But if it's normally in the winter, I'd be brewing on a stovetop. But I have a 10-gallon pot that serves as my mash vessel. I wrap blankets around it and do a step infusion, adding different charges of certain temperature water to get the different rests. And then after it mashes for about 35, 40 minutes, I sparge and put the liquor back into the brew pot and boil on the stove and add my hops and ferment in 6.5-gallon glass carboys, which I have a garage, and I have because the water table where I live is pretty high, so I can't have a basement. So I built a walk-in cooler, 6x9 walk-in cooler that I keep at 54 degrees Fahrenheit. I have a three-door commercial refrigerator that I keep at lagering temperatures and serving temperatures. And then I have the garage floor, which in the wintertime stays around 55 degrees. In the summertime, it gets hot. But because it's so dry in Colorado, I just have to wrap a wet towel around the carboy and douse it every morning a little bit. And even if it's 90 degrees out, you can get the temperature down to 70 degrees just by evaporative cooling. So everything's hands-on. I don't have pumps. It takes me from mash in to pitching the yeast and putting the last clean vessel back on the shelf. It's about 5 hours, which is not too bad, that's because I'm not spending a lot of time cleaning pumps and valves and wort chillers. Oh, my wort chiller, I just immerse it in cold running water for a half hour, 45 minutes. The pot goes in. Theoretically, that's not a cool idea. And I say that in my book, but I also say that it works for me and it might work for you because the malts that we're using are so much better than the malts they were using 30 or 40 years ago when they warned you, don't take too much time to cool your wort because you're going to develop DMS precursors. That doesn't happen. I don't get DMS in my beer and it takes me an hour to cool. So I just do what works. I'm a very experiential brewer and I have to start all over someplace else and build a brewery up from scratch. I'm sure I'd have to adapt to the water and the environment and the space that I have. You just kind of have to adapt and apply your common sense.
Very cool. We had a meeting on brewing disasters where we discussed some of the worst things that happened to us during a brew session. What's your most memorable brewing disaster?
Oh, a few broken carboys by heat shock.
Yikes.
Oh, and I talked about this at the virtual homebrewers conference. If you were listening into that, one of the reasons there's a high water table where I live is there's a creek that runs in the back of our yard. It's a pretty good sized creek. And in the summer it runs all season long and comes out of the mountain. I live about half mile up east of the mountains. So I'm in the flatlands. And I was using the creek to chill my beer, which was really cool. You take your pot, make a little stone pool, and the running water would just chill that beer down in like 20 minutes. It was really worked really well. Well, I made a 5-gallon batch of something and I put it in there and I went away and I wasn't worried about it. The lid was on and, it was safe. And I was doing something and it started clouding up and the sky started to turn pretty black up in the mountains. And there's little lightning and thunder. You could hear the thunder rolling. And it occurred to me, I better check my beer. And as I walked towards the creek had was rising. And as I walked to I panicked. And as I walked towards the pot to save it, because it was rising pretty fast. As I went, I was like, it couldn't have been timed more perfectly. As I was like 3 feet away, just about to reach for that handle, the pot silently just went, whoop, and the beer just floated to Kansas after that.
Oh man.
It was just gone. And I was so bummed out. You know what it's like. You just brew, you spend 5-6 hours making a batch of beer and it's gone in a half a second. And I knew I wouldn't sleep that night. So I crushed some more malt and I started all over again. It was a long brew day, but by the time I was done the day, I had pitched I pitched the yeast into the second batch of the same thing. That was probably the worst disaster I've ever had.
Must have been pretty terrible to watch it just float away. Like
it was heartbreaking.
Oh man. So we've been talking a lot about the good old days and past stuff. We had a lot of questions from our members about what your plans are for your quote unquote retirement. So what keeps you busy these days besides brewing?
Well, up until COVID, I was had a monthly schedule of going somewhere and giving a
Oh,
talk
yeah.
someplace, whether it was in the US of A or somewhere else in the world. There was a lot on my plate, and that kind of came to a virtual pause.
Yeah.
Right.
Um, but I'm working on a few projects. It's one massive project. I've always been an amateur photographer, and I have, suffice to say, many tens of thousands of photographs over my lifetime, including family photos that I've digitized them all, and I've organized them, and I can actually find things now. And as we all know, as we get older, we collect stuff, and then you forget about it. Uh, I kind of went through that last summer, went through everything and cataloged it, and kind of wrote down what I have and got rid of a lot of stuff that I didn't have. It takes time. It
Yeah.
takes a lot of
sure.
time. And if
It
it didn't
sure
have
does.
COVID, I probably wouldn't have time to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I heard that you were also a few years ago, at least, working on a project of interviewing other brewing notables and pioneers. How did that project go?
That was one of the coolest things I've ever been involved in. And it was my last 2 years at the 2.5 years at the Brewers Association. Over 110 pioneer craft brewers I interviewed. They're all videotaped 1 hour long interviews that I had with all the people that were the pioneers that were still around, and they're all archived. And right now, I think the Brewers Association is in a hold pattern. They're not doing anything with it. So it just remains to be seen whether any of that stuff will see the light of day. But
Oh,
Well, that's too bad.
pretty cool stuff that's in those interviews.
yeah.
Really great stories from the likes of Ken Grossman and Kurt Widmer and Larry Bell and Jim Cook and
Well,
Yeah.
that's why I wanted to ask about it, because I had heard about it, but I hadn't heard what the results were. So that's disappointing, actually.
yeah, it is kind of disappointing. There was a plan to do something with it in 2019, but it didn't happen.
Well, on the brighter side, many of our members know Professor Surfett from his column in Zymergy magazine. So where did Professor Surfett come from, and does he have an origin story?
Well, again, drinking too much homebrew and being Professor Surfett needed to answer a lot of questions, and we didn't we wanted to name him appropriately. And at the time, I had discovered this book called Mrs. Burns' Dictionary of Strange and Unusual Words. And just scanning through that book, I came across the word surfeit. It means the overindulgence in drink and food. I thought that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Hence, Professor Surfeit was born. And I have to say, when I wrote the Homebrewer's Companion, which was in the early 90s, I used 10, 12, 13, 14 years of answering questions for Professor Surfeit. I had all those questions that were answered, and I used that as an outline of the kinds of questions that obviously people were experiencing, and they needed to, or problems people were experiencing, they want to know more about. So that helped me formulate the outline for the Homebrewer's Companion, to make sure that all those questions were addressed. And as I got into it, there were more questions that emerged, but it was like, keep it real. I had a little note in front of me, keep it real and practical, and make it intelligible that people will understand what you're talking about, and
Yeah.
injecting a little fun along the way.
Yeah. Speaking of that, what's the craziest question you ever fielded as the professor?
Oh, the craziest question. I don't
Sorry,
know.
didn't mean to stump you.
I'm blanking out on that one.
Sorry.
A lot of questions. I'll relax, not worry about it though.
Yeah, relax, don't worry. Well, with all the different organizations and other things you've been responsible for creating over the years, what I really want to know is, how does the National Pie Day fit into all of this?
It seems like ever since I became an adult, which some people question, sometimes they say you've never grown up, but I've had this fixation with pie as kind of a eccentric thing that I loved, and it kind of fit in with the brewing thing. It turned out, because it was a kind of a tradition and a thing that people always thought was too difficult to do, too much work, and I can't make pie. And so with the same it's too hard to make a crust, and so just. I connected with a whole nother group of people that weren't necessarily into beer, that I learned that people could get jazzed and enthusiastic about the craziest things, and pie was one of them. And I started that when I was a school teacher. I was a full-time school teacher from 1973 to 81. And I would joke around with the kids, and on my birthday, I would always bring pie and a slice of pie. And then one day I said, it's my birthday. Have your mom and dad bring pie to class the next day. And sure enough, pie started showing up on my birthday. And I had this idea of, through conversation, I'm not going to say drinking too much beer, but maybe I ate too much pie. I'm gonna make my birthday National Pie Day, and so I did. I just said it, I just said okay, and my friend said I'll support that, and I sent this entry into what was called the Chase's Calendar of National Events. It was a publication that all the media would use to get ideas to write stories for their, newspapers or magazines. And it still exists now. It's online, I guess, now, but it's Chase's Calendar. And so it got published, and it took off from there. People started calling me from England, from Australia, from all over the country on my birthday, and wanted to interview me. And it got to be a little too much because I have to say, we started the Great American Pie Festival. This was after the Great American Beer Festival got going. We started the Great American Pie Festival, and we judged pies. On the score sheets we had for the beer, we just kind of translated into judging pies. And the thing is, I'm personally speaking, I eat too much sugar in pies, in other people's pies, and I got much more of a hangover from pies than I do from beer. I had to kind of take a few steps back from that. Meanwhile, my friends started the National Pie Council, and he ran that for a few years until it got there was a coup, and it got taken over by the pie industry, and it still exists, and it's the Crisco annual National Pie Bake Off that they hold in Florida every year. And I'm Mr. Pie. My license plate says pies. Everybody wants to know why.
Yeah.
Hey Charlie, what's the best pie and beer taste beer pie combo pairing you've ever had?
Oh, an upside down apple pecan pie, where you take pecans and butter and brown sugar, you line the bottom of the pie plate. So that's going to bake and be a gooey, sticky, pecan-y sweet thing. And then you put your crust down, And then you fill with apples and then the top crust. And then when it comes out of the oven, you flip it
Mhm.
and you got this upside down apple pecan pie. That and an English style barley wine.
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness.
And not,
Sounds decadent.
not American style barley wine, unless it's well aged and not
Right.
Oxford, but like the Thomas Hardy kind of barley wine, that's that coppery, crystal malty kind of just harmonizes with the pecans and the fruity acid from the apples. Phew. I want a piece right now.
Well, Charlie, it's been awesome. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to sharing my screen, and we're going to go to our toast to homebrew, if that's
Oh,
okay.
right. I got my beer here too.
Yeah.
And my taster glass you gave me.
Yeah.
Perfect.
There we go.
Let me get
So I'm going to give everybody a little bit of time to get their beer poured for the toast. And I've got something on the screen right now while everybody's doing that.
Which beer was that again, Lauren?
The impact zone.
Impact Zone West Coast IPA.
Okay, got it.
And I am getting mine into my Barley Engineers tasting glass, as well as Judy's Barley Engineers tasting glass.
I got the drinks. Shut up.
I have this picture on the screen for a reason. I thought that having Rip Current as our toast to homebrewing has a really nice full circle ring to it. A lot of folks might associate Paul Sangster with the Quaff Homebrew Club, and he has been a proud member of that great club. Paul was also, as he mentioned, a member of the Society of Barley Engineers back in the day. And we like to take as much credit as possible for his successes whenever we can. So this is a picture of the Rip Current Brewing receiving the Very Small Brewery of the Year Award in 2015, as the slide says, and as Paul actually mentioned earlier. And some of our longer term club members will recognize three of the folks on the stage as former Barley engineer members as well. Second from the left in the picture is Chris Stoney, and then there's Paul. And then Charlie is on the right-hand side, and next to him is Guy Shoba. And all three of those are former Barley engineer members. And so bringing up the Impact Zone West Coast IPA for a toast, thought that was pretty appropriate. So if everybody has their beer in hand, here's to the awesome world of homebrewing, and here's to the godfather of homebrewing. Thank you, Charlie.
Cheers.
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 Charlie.
Cheers.
Best beef forever.
Thank you, Charlie.
Relax.
Thank you.
Don't worry. Have a homebrew.
Cheers.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Charlie.
How
Hey,
many?
Charlie.
Kind of curious, how
Thanks,
many of
Charlie.
you have I met?
Thank you, Charlie.
Raise your hand.
Well, have you met?
I have two screens up, but
Not
you
enough.
you guys need.
Yeah, go
I heard someone say phone.
Phone.
That goes back a long ways.
All right. Everybody, turn your microphones on. On three. Relax. Don't worry. Have a homebrew. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Relax.
Have a homebrew.
Just broke
No.
through.
Wow.
Brew,
Best
brew,
soup
brew, brew.
Best meeting ever.
As much beer as him, Jimi Hendrix.
I think we just broke the internet. That must have been a first.
Goer. That was awesome, Charlie. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes.
Fun.
Hey, Charlie, I want to sneak a question in there. If God came up to you and says, look, Charlie, I only want there to be 3 styles of beer in the world period, and I want you to pick them, what would you choose?
Ooh.
Great question, Jim.
Rocky Raccoon.
They'd all be around between 5 and 6%,
Good.
dry hopped, hybrid between a lager and a pils, because I don't brew to style. I brew what I like. And
Even better. Yeah.
I need a dark beer, so a stout, and I need a hoppy beer. So a West Coast IPA with, I think Paul was mentioning, he used Galaxy and Savan, New Zealand hop. That's what I have on tap right now. I call it French Galactic beer because I use the Australian Galaxy and Savan for dry hop, double dry hopping. But I call it French IPA because the base hops, I experimented and used French hops, and it turned out so smooth. It was ridiculous. It's something I'm going to keep doing. It was like these hops were probably bred for making lagers, but they have so much cool flavor to them. Anyway, a stout, a dry hop Helles Pils hybrid, and a West Coast type IPA. That's not strong. I like to drink if I'm going to be somewhere, usually a desert island or something. If it's going to be hot, I want to drink a lot and still be able to catch fish to eat.
Yeah. Gary, thank you.
Cool.
Any time for any more questions? Can I throw in a question?
Except to Charlie.
Charlie, do you have time?
Yep.
Oh, okay. What is the next beer nirvana, if you will, for you? What new experience and place in the world or beer style do you want to learn about and then take home and try to brew?
I've always enjoyed going to new places and discovering how people's culture is married to the beers that they're making. And before this COVID nonsense started, I was about to go to Portugal and meet the home brewers and the craft brewers there. That was supposed to happen last November, but that never happened. But I've never been to Portugal at a time when there were home brewers or craft brewers. I was a year and a half ago, I went to Sweden, and it's been quite a while since I've been to Sweden. So that was a new experience too. And I really loved what they were doing there. I went to the Great Swedish Beer Festival, and just their take on how they approach brewing and their enthusiasm is so refreshing. It reminds me of that kind of experience reminds me of what it felt like back in the 80s and 90s when we were all starting and had to recreate something out of nothing or create something out of nothing. And that's what they're doing, really. There's still a lot of places around the world where there are people that are as jazzed and as excited as every one of you are, but they don't have the resources and there's not the culture that's accepting of what they're doing. And they're still, it doesn't inhibit them, and they just charge ahead and with the confidence that they can make great beer and turn people on to something they've never experienced before. So those are the kinds of experiences that I really enjoy mixing my life with. I like to go back to old, I love going to Germany and going to places that I've been before and discovering new places, but in Germany. But I still like to get off the beaten track when I travel around the country, the USA. I usually avoid the big metropolitan areas and try to get out and rent a car and go to small towns and really out of the way places where there are inevitably breweries where you'd never think there'd be breweries, and see how cool it is what people are doing in the most remote areas of the country. It's just so much fun for me to do that. So that's what I endeavor to keep doing.
Thank you, Charlie.
So I think we have time for one last question, if Charlie will put up with us that long.
Yeah, sure. One last question. That'd be cool.
Real simple one, Charlie. I hailed from Colorado Springs myself and was brewing in the 60s. And anyway, you mentioned I so enjoyed the history to listen about your trials and tribulations of your earlier brewing years. Anyway, I was curious about the name Rocky Raccoon. I remember that. Tell me how that name came about.
Well, Rocky Raccoon is a Beatles song that was on their White Album. And
Okay.
and when I was I was a school teacher. My first year as a school teacher, I was teaching really young kids, kindergarten kids, and I made a movie, a Super 8 movie to music, and the music and the words were Rocky Raccoons. And so
Okay.
the kids acted out that story, and I filmed it and put it together, and it was just kind of a silly thing to do, but we all loved doing what we did in those days, and so I had Rocky Raccoon on my mind, and I made this beer, and it just seemed like the obvious choice for a name of a beer. It just kind of flowed off your tongue.
So good. So enjoyed the stories there. And boy, how I wished I could have had your book in the 60s.
I wish I had it. I wish I had it in the early
Extract.
70s.
My first brew had a little can in the Blue Ribbon malt extract with hop flavoring, with a little yeast on the top of it. Wow.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
part of the pioneer group myself.
I can relate to what you just said.
Such an honor. Thank you. Thank you, Charlie.
Cheers.
Yeah, well, I second that emotion. Thank you so much for joining us. It has been an honor and a privilege. And just, what can I say? Thanks and cheers.
You're welcome, wherever you are. I think you're not all in San Diego. You're everywhere around the country, from what I figured out.
Mostly San Diego and California, north and south, but yeah, we have a few spread around the country as well.
And this West Coast IPA is awesome. I can't wait.
Isn't it nice?
Taste the other 5 beers you sent me. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks, guys.
Very cool.
Girls.
Thank you, Charlie.
Fun.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks.
Relax.
Thank you, Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Charlie. Hey, put me
Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
You
Cheers.
around the world.
Many cheers. Deep levels.
Adios.
Cheers.
That was great.
Well done, officers.
Thoroughly enjoyed that.
Way to go. Thanks, officer, for making it happen. That's fantastic.
Damn good.
Yep.
We're all gonna wake up and this was just a dream.
Now, apparently somebody's recorded this, yes?
Yeah.
I used to drop